Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the U.S. Asia Institute's webinar, Northeast Asia's 2025 Climate Agenda, Global and Regional Implications. My name is Patrick Wilson, and I'm a program assistant here at the U.S. Asia Institute. For those who have attended our events in the past, welcome back. And for those who are new to the U.S. Asia Institute, thank you for joining us. USA is a nonpartisan United Nations nonprofit with a 46-year track record of building understanding and strengthening the ties between people of governments of the United States and Asia. Today's webinar is part of our Northeast Asian Focus webinar series. We hope to offer unique insights into U.S. partnerships with Northeast Asian nations through experts with firsthand knowledge of global power, competition, and the region. I'd like now to introduce our moderator, Ben Wu. Mr. Wu has been the vice chairman of USAI since January 2011. With an internationally recognized technology policy expertise, he has extensive public and private sector experience leading organizational transformation and innovative initiatives at the highest ranks of presidential and congressional service on the national, state, and local levels. Mr. Wu has served as the U.S. Deputy Under Secretary of Commerce for Technology and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Technology Policy in the administration of President George W. Bush. Prior to joining the Bush administration, Mr. Wu held the senior staff position on So with Mr. Wu's words and
Patrick, thank you. You broke up a little bit. I don't know if that was on my end or on your end, but just wanted to let you know. But thank you for the introduction and welcome everyone to this morning's U.S. Asia Institute webinar as we take a closer look at the global and country implications of the Northeast Asia region's climate agenda. And we're going to spend the next hour in conversation and taking your questions with Dr. Scott Moore, the China Fellow for the Wilson Center and Director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania, and Dr. Jackson Ewing, Director of Energy and Climate Policy of the Nicholas Institute at Duke University. So let me introduce our two distinguished guest scholars. Dr. Moore is a professor, author, and an international affairs expert on climate change, China, and also water security, who has worked at both the State Department and the World Bank Group. His latest book, China's Next Act: How Sustainability and Technology Are Reshaping China's Rise and the World's Future, explores China's growing influence in shaping global systems and what it means for action on climate change and other global challenges. Dr. Ewing holds faculty affiliations at the Duke School of the Environment, the Duke Center for International Development at the Sanford School of Public Policy, the Duke Asian Pacific Studies Center, and the Duke Kunshan University International Masters of Environmental Policy Program. And he also focuses on advanced global energy transitions through his work on climate finance, energy system partnerships, international carbon pricing, and U.S.-China relations. And just like his Duke student, Cooper Flagg, he's also a top draft pick at Duke University for climate change. So Dr. Moore and Dr. Ewing, we've seen how global climate concerns and the green energy transition is impacting Northeast Asia from an environmental, an economic, and a political perspective. The countries in the region recognize that they, both individually and collectively, have immense potential to address these concerns and lead the way in sustainability. The region itself has the potential to position as a model for clean energy development with shared resources, joint innovation, and interconnected energy systems. And Northeast Asian countries have been making significant strides in the green energy transition and also with climate change mitigation, each with distinct approaches and priorities. For China, their massive investments in renewables offers deep regional collaboration opportunities as a global leader in renewable energy investment and production. It's set ambitious targets for carbon neutrality by 2060, and it is dominating the global solar panel market, producing 80% of the world's supply. Japan also has been focusing on energy efficiency and technological innovation in renewables. And the country is also investing in offshore wind farms and hydrogen energy as part of its strategy to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. South Korea has also been making significant progress in reducing fossil fuel dependency, particularly through increased nuclear energy output and also its renewable energy expansion as well, too. And South Korea has pledged to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 with investments in smart grids and energy storage solutions. Now, you will see in Mongolia, it's also leveraging its vast renewable energy potential, particularly in wind and solar power. And there's also potential opportunities for regional cooperation with a collaborative project such as the Northeast Asia Super Grid, which aims to improve energy connectivity and access to clean electricity throughout the region, involving China, Japan, South Korea, Mongolia, and northeastern Russia. So we have a lot to discuss. And so let me turn it over to our experts. Thank you, Dr. Moore, and also Dr. Ewing, for your participation and allowing the attendees at this webinar to be able to hear some of your insights and sharing your expertise. So Dr. Moore, please let me go ahead and take it away.
Sure thing, and thanks very much to you, Ben, and to the U.S. Asia Institute for the opportunity to join Jackson, an old friend and dear colleague. And so I think what we'll try to do is I'll maybe try to focus my remarks a little bit on the Northeast Asian region in particular. And I believe Jackson may focus more on China, but happy to kind of mix and match those things in the discussion and Q&A portion as may be of interest to those of you who are joining us. So I think if we kind of think about Northeast Asia as a region in relation to climate and sustainability, I think there's sort of an interesting question of whether that is more an area for convergence, cooperation, between the countries and regions of Northeast Asia, or of divergence. I think there are more or less equally strong cases to be made for both of those, and I'll just briefly sketch out why I think that's the case. Certainly, what we would hope for, and I think the sort of our conventional wisdom or intuition would be that climate change and sustainability and energy a little bit more generally should be an area of convergence for the countries and regions of Northeast Asia. This should be an area and a domain in which there should be considerable scope for cooperation. And certainly there are good reasons to think that that may be the case. And it's maybe worth, I think, just sort of framing at the outset that although we're kind of focused here on climate and energy issues, that is an area that really is hard to divorce from other policy domains, including trade and investment on the one hand, and security and geopolitics on the other. And so I think if we're thinking about that question of whether we're headed more for convergence or more for divergence, it's important to keep those linkages in mind. The reason to think that climate and energy may be a good area for cooperation and convergence, I think, departs mainly from the trade and investment picture. This is an economically very closely connected region. Perhaps one of the best connected regions in the world in terms of infrastructure linkages. And also, I think importantly, from a climate perspective, countries and regions that actually have a lot of similarity in terms of the extent of urbanization and the way that energy is used in the economies of much of Northeast Asia. And that presents, at least in theory, I think some good reasons for cooperation. And Ben mentioned the Northeast Asian sort of super grid idea. This is an idea that's kind of been cropping up in a number of regions around the world. Southeast Asia is another, where in order to really try to tap the potential of renewable and low carbon energy sources, one of the things that you need to do, or at least would be highly preferable to do, is to better integrate power grids across national borders. For the most part, power grids in much of the world are really fragmented around those national borders because countries understandably build infrastructure, thinking mostly of their own populations and territories as opposed to that of their neighbors. But if you think about trying to integrate sources of renewable and low carbon energy, whether it's hydropower or wind energy, those resources don't follow national borders very easily, and so it's much harder to integrate those new sources of zero and low carbon energy into the grid. So a regional kind of super grid makes a lot of sense for a lot of places for climate reasons, but I would argue it probably makes more economic and sort of infrastructural sense in Northeast Asia because of the commonalities in terms of how energy is used, the density of the built environment, and the relatively good infrastructure. That being said, it's certainly not not an easy prospect, and I think the relatively slow progress toward that initiative is testament to that. We can certainly talk more about that if of interest. The other sort of aspect of cooperation in this area that I think is worth mentioning is that although recently the focus has kind of shifted more toward climate change in particular, there's a pretty good track record of cooperation on other environmental issues, most notably air pollution, going back 15 or 20 years, with something that sort of has a little bit of an unfortunate acronym, in English at least, NECAP, the Northeast Asian Clean Air Partnership, but that has been a pretty long-running effort to share technical assistance and cooperation to reduce air pollution in Northeast Asia, which, I would say prior to about a decade ago, was probably the dominant environmental concern. One other thing I think that's worth mentioning that we haven't seen a huge amount of cooperation on so far, but that I think we could, and there would be a lot of substantive scope for in the climate and energy domain, is on adaptation to climate change as opposed to mitigation. So really trying to think about how you better equip cities, those large built environments that are characteristic of Northeast Asia for the most part, to the effects of climate change. That's an area where I think there's really a lot of shared challenges that again look very similar, but there's a lot of scope for increased collaboration. Incidentally, Japan is probably the world leader in thinking about a key aspect of adaptation, which is disaster response and assistance. And I think that's an area that that there's lots of scope for increased regional cooperation on. Divergence, though, and here's where I think there's kind of an equally good case to be made that in climate and energy we may actually see a kind of a trend the other way in the region, and this is where the politics and geopolitics come into play. The world in general is changing fast, I think, from a geopolitical perspective, and it's hard to keep up. But obviously, there are profound tensions and prospects for conflict in the region, especially over disputed regions and territories. And another kind of commonality that applies to parts of the Northeast Asian region is the way in which energy security has become and would become certainly much more so in a conflict scenario, a key national strategic priority. Many of the countries and regions of Northeast Asia are heavily dependent on imported fuels, especially imported fossil fuels that are very easy to disrupt or interdict in a conflict scenario. That, of course, is very true of Taiwan. It's also true of Japan and South Korea to some extent, though a little bit less so. And I'm looking forward to traveling to Taiwan early next year for a class that is called The Geopolitics of Energy Security, in which we're going to look at Taiwan as sort of a case study for a part of the world that has a very strong energy security rationale for investing in renewable and low carbon sources of energy, but hasn't really done so very aggressively. And I'm interested in better understanding, sort of why that's the case and the political economy of that. But I mentioned that just to say that that's sort of another way of looking at this issue that I think could steer us more toward divergence rather than convergence, and climate and energy as really a new, or different domain of conflict and competition rather than cooperation per se. Happy to talk about all of that in more detail, but I'll stop there for now, and happy to hand things over to Jackson.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Thank you, Ben and Patrick and the whole US Asia Institute team for having me. It's always a pleasure and also a bit intimidating to follow Scott. So I will try to offer some complimentary thoughts to what he's laid out to get us started. I want to start with China, then move to broader Northeast Asia and look further afield in the Asia Pacific. Um, Beginning with China, I think that we're at something of an inflection point. And that is to say that we've, over the past roughly decade, with some pause for the COVID disruption, seen an expansion of coal-fired power production in China alongside a massive expansion of other forms of energy, including renewable energy sources. And this, of course, is globally significant, given that China is far and away the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. That is, in my estimation, starting to shift with a real plateauing of coal-fired power installations likely already begun, and potential for some relative decline in the near term, and an even more rapid expansion of solar and wind, as well as the attendant sectors of batteries and electric vehicles. So what are the earmarks of that kind of inflection point, if in fact it is happening? One is that the solar, battery, and EV parts of the economy are growing in prominence relative to overall GDP. So these sectors over the past year have grown at roughly 3 times the rate of the broader GDP growth in China, and have really been the key sectors towards enabling China to reach its overall growth target, which it did barely. They now represent almost a fifth of the total Chinese GDP. And with that growth in their representation in the economy, is a growth in prominence and political prioritization. That also will have international implications for China's outbound investment, which I'll speak to in just a moment. The scale here is really kind of jaw-dropping. China now has enough renewable electricity to power all of the electricity needs in India, which is really quite amazing. And its clean technology patents are also skyrocketing. So this is not just the case of importing IP from elsewhere. This is the case of real indigenous growth in clean energy innovation, as well as being this hub for manufacturing and production. Clean tech patents in China rose roughly 10x between 2010 and 2022. There are still a number of challenges in China that had the potential to slow this transition significantly. One is the need to continue to build out physical grid infrastructure, as well as reform power sector practices that can allow for the more efficient onboarding of this renewable infrastructure that I've just referenced. And that's a story that has progressed kind of in fits and starts. And we can speak more about that in the discussion. But as per the sort of regional context here, one area that Scott didn't mention that I want to weigh in on is on carbon markets and the potential for some carbon market connectivity and kind of the state of play in carbon markets in Northeast Asia. By carbon market here, I mean some cap on carbon emissions that leads to different commitments that are spread out among companies in a covered sector that they either have to meet in their own operations or purchase credits from others or from the government to make up for the ways in which they exceed their emissions limitations. And there are important developments in China, Korea, and Japan along this front, alongside the potential for some future connectivity. So in China, been operating regional pilot ETSs, that's emissions trading schemes or emissions trading systems, since the mid-2010s, and launched a national system in the early 2020s. That system is set to expand from just covering the power sector to covering industrial sectors of cement, aluminum, and steel this year. And so that in turn will broaden the coverage of the overall system in China's economy and bring on thousands of new companies that will now face this same kind of emissions constraint. And this is important, I think, because it sends a market signal within the kind of core sectors of the Chinese economy that the energy transition is something that they need to really prioritize in their own operations and integrate in the same way that they've prioritized production increases and efficiency increases in the past. Now, at risk of getting a little too technical, one of the earmarks of the Chinese ETS that's important to understand is that it's an efficiency-based system, which means that rather than having an aggregate kind of just plain number of tons of emissions that you are allowed to emit in the absence of credits, you have a ratio of your output to those emissions, meaning that you have to try to make your operations more less carbon intensive over time. So you'll be able to emit fewer tons of greenhouse gases per your level of output in steel and cement and power production, et cetera. I bring that up because one, it can slow the Chinese carbon market's ability to rapidly transition its own economy's carbon intensity, and it also makes connectivity with other countries more difficult. Now, in terms of those other countries and connectivity, I think we have to start with Japan and Korea. Japan has operated subnational markets in Tokyo and Saitama Prefecture for many years, but it is now in the process of transitioning a voluntary carbon market called the GX ETS, which covers over 700 companies and roughly 50% of the country's overall emissions, to a mandatory market, which could happen as early as 2026. Korea has operated the Korean ETS again since the late 2010s. It's entering into its third phase. And so that has wide coverage of the economy and also is a pillar of their climate and energy policy. Has traditionally given some protection to its industries that are vulnerable to the machinations of international trade, but is gradually kind of integrating stronger constraints on those industries as well. Now, the reason that I bring this up in terms of regional connectivity is that there have long been arguments that, like the power grid integration that Scott just mentioned, that there's potential for carbon market integration among these Northeast Asian powers for many of the same reasons that Scott mentioned. There's enormous trade integration already present in terms of the movement of physical goods among these countries. And with that, you could have a more levelized playing field if you got some harmonization of these carbon markets that were putting similar sorts of carbon constraints on the production of those products. And you could also get cheaper carbon reduction options, particularly for Japan and Korea, through investing in reductions that would happen in China that then could be accounted for in their own emissions regime. This is difficult, similarly to how grid integration is hard. And in that case, grid integration, even domestically in China among provinces, is proving difficult. So across national borders, it's likely to be even more so. But each of these systems have their own characteristics. And so connecting them and having fungible credits that cross boundaries is going to be a really heavy lift. But it is something that has reached the level of the Trilateral Summit. It is something that we've seen the architects of the different systems in dialogue about really since their inception. And so there is the potential in the future of some connectivity on climate and energy in that realm. I also think that it's important to consider the implications of particularly Chinese, but also broader Northeast Asian policies on climate and energy for the wider region. I'll give just a few anecdotes here and wrap up with that. One is that China's outbound investment in the energy sector in particular has, similarly to the domestic picture, really undergone significant change during the 2020s. In 2021, President Xi at the UN General Assembly, actually in New York, declared that China would no longer invest in international developments of coal-fired power generation. And China has stuck to that in terms of investing in new production. However, China has continued to invest and drive projects that were already in the pipeline at that point, and so still has a large presence in the coal sector internationally. But with that change, we have seen a real shift in the levels of investment in fossil internationally versus renewables. And as China's own production has scaled at home, that ability to export and to produce renewable energy in emerging economies elsewhere in Asia, as well as Africa and Latin America, but I'll leave that to the side, has grown in turn. So we have seen roughly 70% of the international energy investment in 2022 and 2023 be in renewables. That's compared to just 13% from 2000 to 2021. So a real kind of shift, and the data suggests that in 2024, that trend has continued. The EV sector is another good example where China has achieved scale at home with international implications. BYD, the major auto manufacturer, estimates that half of its sales will be international by 2030. In terms of large emerging economies in Asia, I think Pakistan and Indonesia both are instructive. In Pakistan, we saw the importation of almost 17 gigawatts of solar panels from China in 2024. Again, kind of a jaw-dropping number. Most of these are distributed solar panels, so they're off the grid in Pakistan and are responding to inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in that grid, which then in turn creates more problems for the Pakistani power grid system, while also having the virtuous effect of bringing more electricity to those who have previously lacked access to it. In Indonesia, a set of domestic policies have required that much of the production and processing of critical minerals and of renewable energy happen within Indonesia's borders, and China has stepped up to invest in things like nickel processing, where Indonesia is a global leader, as well as solar panel manufacturing in Indonesia behind the activity of Chinese companies that are actually operating there. So this all, I think, has relevance certainly for those emerging economies, but also for the foreign policy of the other Northeast Asian powers. You know, Japan, through leadership at the Asia Development Bank, as well as through JICA and other foreign policy instruments, has traditionally been a large investor in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And with the presence of, and Korea also having a very relevant presence, with the increased strategic importance of renewable energy as sectors, as kind of sectors that are driving GDP growth and increasing human flourishing in many of these settings, as Scott says, you have a potential for competition. Some of that competition might be virtuous and have really positive outcomes for those destination countries, as well as kind of virtuous competition that can increase the effectiveness of the domestic firms in Northeast Asia. But in other cases, it could be more contentious, and we could see more kind of competition for gaining geopolitical footholds throughout the region. That's nothing new. I'm not suggesting that it is. What I am suggesting is that the role of clean energy, clean technology, clean green industrialization is growing in that competitive landscape in terms of importance. So I'll stop there. Back over to you, Ben. Thanks again for the chance to talk.
Well, thank you, Dr. Ewing, and also Dr. Moore for your very comprehensive and thoughtful remarks. So let me start it off with just a few questions, and then I'm going to throw it over to the audience for audience Q&A, and then we'll wrap up. But Let me start off with Dr. Moore. You wrote a book, China's Next Act, and I see it propped up behind you. And I wanted to touch a little bit about some of the things that you had discussed in your book. Your book re-envisions China's role in the world in terms of sustainability and technology. And you suggest that this reframing is essential because none of these increasingly pressing shared global challenges can be tackled without China. And because they're not just reshaping China's economy, but also foreign policy as well as the global stage as well, too. And that the challenges posed by climate change and including emerging technologies and pandemics and others mean that we have to deal with China and its state-owned enterprises and its institutions more than ever, especially if we want to achieve global solutions. You wrote this book back in a different presidential administration, where they really tried to make climate change and energy security a priority. This administration tends to be looking more at the tariffs and just had conversations in Sweden with some of the US and China officials. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of an update from your perspective, focusing on some of the things that you had raised in your book, and discuss how you think that this new administration should look at some of the issues that were raised in your book.
Thanks so much, Ben, and I appreciate you picking up on the subtle product placement. I do try to at least keep it subtle. So the book was written. I started writing it in 2017, so soon after the Trump administration took office, and really kind of precipitated. It wasn't exactly a sharp break, but I would say a profound change in the way that the U.S.-China relationship was thought of, not just by government and in Washington, but really across the United States in a way that probably hadn't happened since 1979, in terms of just a real, reevaluation of why the United States and China interact, for what purposes, and to what with what sort of consequences for both countries. And I wrote the book really to try to prove or at least establish that the U.S.-China relationship really matters, and will matter into the future for two big reasons. The first is essentially that we live on the same planet. That's the sustainability piece, and China is the single most important actor when it comes to pretty much any global environment or sustainability issue, and that's true whether you're talking about climate change as the world's largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, whether you're talking about the future of the world's biodiversity, or indeed whether you're talking about global public health, which is something we haven't talked as much about for the last 2 or 3 years, but certainly talked a lot about for the 2 or 3 years before that. China is the biggest and most important actor in all of that, and no matter what differences or changes you might have in the economic or the political areas, which are really the two areas that the U.S.-China relationship had previously been focused on for most of the reform era after 1979, you've got to stay engaged with China for those sort of global public good issues. The other set of things and the other reason that there needs to be a constructive U.S.-China relationship is China's similarly central and crucial role in emerging technologies, whether it's the relatively well-known AI space, whether it's biotech, whether it's robotics, something that doesn't receive as much attention, but is maybe the area in which China's technological progress has been most impressive, at least in the sort of emerging technology area. In all of these spheres, China is a really crucial actor, not just as a competitor, but as a source of solutions to the challenges that those technologies will create, and to the opportunities, to seizing the opportunities that those technologies create as well. So which is another way of saying, if you kind of step back and, strip out all of the other issues in the US-China relationship, we will really have to deal with the consequences of China's decisions and the developments that are taking place in China in these two domains, sustainability and technology, irrespective of everything else. And it's crucial that we figure out how to maintain a constructive relationship in those two areas. That's really the fundamental message. Just very briefly in terms of what that means and what that looks like now. I think a key kind of aspect of the last decade has been just really a collapse of trust on both sides of the Pacific in the United States and China. You see that especially in the shriveling of people-to-people ties. Really, the only major exception to that is the Chinese student population in the United States, but that too may shrink significantly into the next couple of years. What I think is essential is that we focus on trying to rebuild some trust and some communication, especially at the people-to-people level, in the coming years. I do hope and think that the kind of recent tariff agreement will help to facilitate that. I think that has been a real kind of the festering issue in the relationship for the last decade has been the future of the US-China economic relationship, which after all is really the bedrock of the relationship. So I'm hopeful that this recent agreement, and certainly you can debate who came out better from this spat, but I'm hopeful that provides the foundation to start looking into the future, to start rebuilding trust, and ideally to start tackling some of these really crucial issues in the sustainability and technology domains.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Moore. I think I mentioned Sweden. I meant to say Switzerland. So, Dr. Ewing, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Sure. I want to begin, I suppose, by doubling down on Scott's last point about rebuilding trust and communication, where I couldn't agree more on the importance of that, particularly at this moment where our track one government-to-government relations are fraught and are difficult. And like Scott, I hope that some recent convergence on trade might have a ripple effect to the broader relationship. But that also is enormously important for global dialogue within global institutions. I think it's really difficult to overstate how important the series of 3 bilateral agreements between the US and China on climate change between 2014 and 2016 were to the global diplomatic effort to address climate. I would submit that the Paris Agreement, which continues to guide our international climate governance and broader collaborative efforts, would not have been ratified and agreed upon in the form that it is without that sort of explicit, overt bilateral dialogue and relationship that the US and China had at that moment. And that really was the result of years of task force interaction, of high-level people-to-people exchanges from Secretary John Kerry here in the United States and Special Envoy Xi Jinping in China, as well as their teams, which over those years were able not just to hammer out those agreements, but to continue communication, albeit in fits and starts in the subsequent years. That is on pause at present, to put it lightly. And so it's, I think, incumbent on others from outside of those direct government-to-government relations to try to carry the torch of this continued trust building through different sorts of communication that we might have at subnational levels, that we might have in civil society or university to university or technical cooperation, et cetera. It's profoundly important for the future of climate and clean energy globally and for the countries themselves. The other thing I guess I would bring up really been in response to your question about what's changed since Scott began writing that book. I would suggest that the importance of critical minerals in the broader relationship has grown. And that's a very difficult reality in many ways for the United States to face, which is that China has just enormous control over the value chains of many core critical minerals, particularly on processing, but even upstream from processing on the machines that are produced to do the processing, et cetera. And then, as well as going to the extractive activities in the countries that are producing these critical minerals. China really has a fairly comprehensive global lead across that entire value chain, which creates vulnerabilities for the United States and for other countries that seek to acquire these critical minerals, yes, for clean technology, but also for defense and broader AI and technological purposes. And so, I'm to put my cards on the table, I suppose personally, I'm in the dwindling minority of commenters on this that would like to see the U.S. and China play to their respective strengths and collaborate on the global critical mineral value chain. And I think that they could both gain benefits from that. But what's actually happening in reality is really more fierce strategic competition in that sector. And that includes bilateral critical mineral agreements being signed between the U.S. and Japan, for example. That includes convergence between the EU and other Northeast Asian powers, as well as the EU and the United States on critical minerals, all of which are trying to reduce their own vulnerabilities to China's dominance of that supply chain. So I think that is an arena where we're going to see this kind of contentious trade and geopolitical maneuvering increase in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Ewing. In your remarks, you had discussed the emissions trading system, the ETSs. They're a market-based tool. And I was wondering if you could give us what you think is an update on whether or not these market-based tools will continue to be successful and attractive for investors and companies and countries at this time, given some of the issues related to our global economy, in efforts to try to cut emissions regionally and globally. And then also, what's the overall role of the international climate finance today, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, whether or not their emphasis on infrastructure and energy projects can continue to influence its climate finance contributions?
Thanks for the questions. Those are tough. I'll try to be brief. I'll start with the second one on international climate finance. China is extremely reticent to commit within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to providing climate finance through the structures that are present within that system, because China understandably views itself as an emerging economy itself, and so does not see itself as having that commitment to contribute to things like the Green Climate Fund, which is located in Korea, or the Global Environmental Facility, et cetera, or other things that are kind of caught within that basket of global climate finance at an official UN level. So when we hear the arguments at the conferences of parties, the large climate summits about capitalizing international climate finance, China is largely on the outside of the supply of that finance. But that's misleading because, as you rightly allude to in your question, things like the Belt and Road Initiative and China's broader outbound investment, such as that which I spoke about in Indonesia and Pakistan just a few minutes ago, is enormously important for filling infrastructure gaps in many emerging economies throughout the world. And much of that investment does pertain to clean energy. And the volume there is large. And China has the ability to defray some of its excess capacity at home and kind of leverage its manufacturing scale and acumen to really rapidly serve some of these emerging economies, which have enormous demand for clean energy sources. And the trend there has the potential for real acceleration. On markets, when we think about international investment into markets, there, I think we're talking more about voluntary carbon market transactions than the sort of emissions trading systems that exist in Japan, Korea, and China, which are more domestic in nature and don't really have that same emissions reduction or profitability calculus that an investor might find in the voluntary market. The answer to your question about how attractive are those market mechanisms likely to be in the future for those sorts of international investments, I think comes down to how sturdy many of the net zero and broader kind of carbon accounting and mitigation targets are for major firms. Provided major international firms continue to have those sorts of net zero targets or ambitious climate mitigation targets for their own operations, then they're going to need to be purchasing credits, and they'll need to be investing in voluntary carbon market credits, which will in turn be a pipeline for capital to reach emerging economies to produce those credits. If we see those targets soften, and I think there's some evidence that that is in fact the case, then that demand for carbon credits will go down and the investment calculus will change.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Dr. Ewing. I wanted to open it up for questions and answers from the audience. I apologize for not giving you an advance notice, but if you have a question, please put your virtual hand up and we can identify you. And also, if you could identify yourself and your organization when you ask your question, that'd be very helpful, I think, for Dr. Moore and also Dr. Ewing. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to go ahead and just raise your virtual hand and we'll recognize you. Well, while we're waiting for questions, let me go ahead and take advantage of the time that we have with Dr. Moore and Dr. Ewing and ask them for their thoughts about international cooperation. Both of you have talked about the importance of global alliances as we try to overcome some of these challenges that face each of our countries and also our world, because climate change recognizes no political or geographic borders. What are the areas that you would suggest that the United States could engage in, recognizing the priorities of this current administration that could help advance the cause and to allow for a greater dialogue with our global partners, especially in Northeast Asia?
It's a tough question, Ben. I mean, I think, and we've already kind of talked about one, I think, key element of it, which is getting beyond diplomacy and the idea that the U.S. federal government is the key kind of actor here, especially the executive branch. I think non-state engagement is one piece of that. Congressional engagement is perhaps another. Subnational is yet another. So state, local governments in the United States below the federal government level, all of those constituencies do remain, and parts of the private sector, of course, as well, do remain really concerned with climate change and continue to work heavily in that area, including with lots of counterparts in Northeast Asia. So I think that work will continue. Admittedly, it is a lot harder than it used to be. And just speaking sort of from the perspective of someone trying to figure out that piece of the equation, our whole financial and operational model is really kind of set up to talk to the U.S. executive branch. And when there is no audience in the executive branch, that's a pretty profound reorientation that has to take place. But I do think it's possible. It makes it sort of harder. It's much less efficient because you don't have like one level of that you're sort of trying to engage with. But I think it's possible, and certainly it doesn't prevent us from trying to engage governments in Northeast Asia. So I think that's a way forward. And I mean, certainly, I think there are aspects of the climate arena where the U.S. will continue to still play some role. It just won't be called climate, and it won't take place in the fora that we're used to climate sort of issues being discussed. The U.S. obviously won't be part of the Paris Agreement talks. Hopefully, it will still send a delegation to the UN Framework Convention on climate change negotiations, but it won't be part of the true multilateral spaces. So it'll shrink, reorient, but hopefully still be present.
Yeah, I agree with everything Scott says there. We have seen in the past where there is some federal retrenchment on climate in the United States, the sorts of subnational cooperation that Scott alludes to there. During the first Trump administration, for example, when President Trump declared the U.S. intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change, President Xi hosted California Governor Jerry Brown in Beijing shortly after that to talk about California's collaboration with China, as well as city-to-city kinds of collaboration between some major cities in California and major cities in China, just as an anecdote and as an example of how that can be galvanizing. I think on a broader level, while, as Scott mentioned, at least in the US, we will perhaps not frame this in terms of climate change, there is enormous market possibility and opportunity in clean energy development and energy development more broadly. And carbon constraints are still going to exist in many of those markets, both developed and developing. One example of this that pertains to Northeast Asia is Japan's importation of liquid natural gas. Japan has importers of liquid natural gas that have very, very steep standards for what the embedded carbon content of that natural gas needs to be. And so they require really detailed life cycle analyses of how much has been emitted during the extraction and processing and transportation of that natural gas. They'll sometimes combine that with carbon credits to create so-called carbon neutral natural gas, et cetera. And that's a market signal. And that's a market signal to US LNG producers that they need to be able to compete with other sources of LNG, like those from Central Asia, for example, on a carbon content kind of platform. And so the global marketplace transcends the desires of or agendas of a single country, even if it is in the United States case, one of the most influential and powerful countries in the world.
Thank you. We have a question from Worth Kelly, who asked, I was wondering what industries in Northeast Asia are the hardest to decarbonize, and are there any strategies being used to address them?
Well, I think you would have to say that it goes with just sort of most carbon intensive. So steel, cement, chemicals are usually the big three in terms of kind of heavy industries. If you kind of interpret that more to mean sectors, I would actually say transport is the hardest, especially aviation and shipping. In my view, those will probably be the last sectors to completely decarbonize. But for the heavy industries, those kind of steel, cement, and chemical industries tend to be the most difficult mostly because of the high temperatures that are required for those industrial applications, which means obviously you're inputting a lot more heat, which is for the moment hard to generate other than from fossil fuels because of the energy density required to reach those really high temperatures. But we are making some progress on that. I think it's conceivable that that could all be electrified, but otherwise, green hydrogen is a promising source of a low non-carbon, well, in the case of green hydrogen, at least non-carbon fuel that we could use for those applications.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly to that Japan and Korea are real leaders in the hydrogen space. They have made larger investments in some instances, like in transportation. For example, Korea is the sort of largest investor in the development of green or of hydrogen for transportation in the world. They made a large bet on that, and that trickles down to their key firms like Hyundai, et cetera. And both Japan and Korea view hydrogen as a potential pathway for improving their own energy security alongside their decarbonization goals. And as Scott says, that we're looking at heavy industry that has the kind of combustion potential to melt limestone to make cement, or to convert ore into steel at those sorts of high temperatures. So promise with the hydrogen, there's a long way to go in developing the broader value chain for hydrogen. But I think that there's plenty of evidence that North Korea and Japan are taking that challenge most seriously, really, of any countries in the world. In China, the one thing I would add is on carbon capture, a utilization and sequestration. That's the other pathway, really, to decarbonizing these hard to abate sectors. And whereby, sure, you still have the combustion of coal or less frequently natural gas to produce these industrial products, but you capture the emissions at the source and either sequester them underground or find some use for those emissions, whether it be producing a product or whether it be used to extract more oil, which I recognize seems kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul, but still is a way to more efficiently extract resources that you would already be pursuing. And China's making pretty big investments in CCUS, and has done some successful piloting at industrial levels. And as we see these carbon constraints begin to take hold that I referenced earlier through the emissions trading system, that could incentivize, if that system becomes more effective, more carbon capture and utilization and sequestration in the future.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Ewing and Dr. Moore. Unbelievably, we've come to the close of our time. This has been a wonderful conversation with many more thoughts left on the table, but we really appreciate the fact that you have shared your knowledge and insights with us today. We also want to thank our participants for joining us today. They represent so many different constituencies. Watching how the Northeast Asia region engages gives U.S. policymakers and government officials a better understanding of the economic security impacts of the global energy market. For the business leaders and investors, highlighting market opportunities, economic returns, and industry leadership in the region has been a focus. For the scholars and researchers who are with us, they recognize that the green energy transition is as much a scientific challenge as it is an economic or geopolitical one. And for the environmental and social advocacy group representatives with us, they wanted to hear about the moral responsibility, environmental justice, and community engagement needed to take decisive action today for our future generations. So this has all been very helpful to those who have joined us today. Thank you all. Jackson and Scott Really appreciate the time that you've taken. Now I'll turn it back over to Patrick for final comments. And I should also add, on behalf of the U.S. Asia Institute, especially our chairman, Glenn Lau-Key, and also our president, Mary Sue Bissell, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. Patrick?
Yep. Again, yeah, I would just like to thank Jackson, Scott, and Ben for speaking on today's panel and for our audience attending. So while we're out of time for the briefing portion of today's event, if you'd like to follow up with any of today's speakers, please reach out to USAI, and we'd be happy to assist in fostering further dialogue on the things we discussed. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you, everybody.